This is Bob G. Can you hear me?
How you doing, Bob?
Hey, how you doing? You in the daily update from you on email, you had mentioned looking for option prices that are not only cheap, but cheaper than they normally are. So can you show me or tell me what should be looked for when I look for what they are normally?
Really glad that you asked that. What I do, and I typically do this on Tuesdays, is I go to my Ask Value scan. What I did this morning was for 11:15, so I'm just looking to about the next month. So we're in October, and when there gets to be a few weeks, I'll move to the next month, and so I go to the November expiration. I'm looking for cheap options. Typically go with on Tuesday. And I sort this list like this, looking at the cheapest ones relative to value. And so what decile one is, when I do this, when I'm looking at the ask value scan, what we do is we break this, everything that's optionable in the market gets broken up and fit into one of these groups. The cheapest options go in decile one, the most expensive options go in decile 10. So we just break it up into 10 groups and we put them together with the ones that are in their price range, right? Relative to value. So these are the cheapest options in the market here in decile one. So what I was talking about this morning is that with volatility in the overall market, if we go back and look at VIX here, with volatility getting higher, general market volatility is moving up and options are getting more expensive. So to be in decile one just means that they're the cheapest options relative to their value. It doesn't mean that they're as cheap as they have been in the past. What I like to do is just thinking about this as I go through here, and I'm going to go grab one that I did look at, which was United Airlines, UAL. Here and pull up UAL. When I look at the implied volatility on UAL, I can see back here it was really low. And that implied volatility gives me a measure of the option prices for UAL. So I know that they're cheap relative to the market, but the implied volatility is actually kind of high on these options. I would probably be able to do a straddle for that expiration and still buy the options cheaper than they're valued. But how much cheaper are they? We can take a look. The other thing that I do when I'm looking at these is I'll look here and try to get an idea. Number 15, they're cheaper than they are right here. To look at the different time frames in the term structure, make sure I'm getting the best deal. I want to pay the least amount of money for the most amount of time when I'm buying options. So in this case, I might even go out to December if I was actually going to do a trade. But the 15th works fine. That's what my scan was based on. That's the time frame that I was looking for. So if I go to November 15th, I'm just going to pull up an MDM graph. So here you can see that MDM graph looks pretty close to the bell curve. Pretty darn close, not much advantage there. Change this out to the 15th. I'm guessing different, a little bit of an advantage. You have more blue going above the line over here on this side. So you have a little bit of an advantage. Stock moves bigger to the downside, just slightly. This is telling us that the options aren't that cheap. But if I go look at a straddle at that time period, it's trading at 88.41. 41 is probably closer to 90. So I would consider the 90 straddle if I was doing a straddle, and you can see that the FOV is higher than the net debit of that trade right now. I went back in time, and this is one of the great benefits of odds online. I can go here and I can actually take the software back when the implied volatility back in July. I'm going to go back to July 23rd. So I can just come up here and take this back in time to July 23rd and just do some kind of a comparison to see how cheap the options were here relative to that expectation. So if I go out a little bit, so the options I was considering were November. So I have October expiration November. From July, that would be like going from August and going to November. So November 20th. Choose those options. You can see that this shows that these options are cheap relative to their own past. So they're even cheaper. So in both cases, the options are cheap relative to the market. They're in the cheapest bracket. But how cheap are they is what I'm trying to figure out. Are they really cheap or are they just slightly cheap? And when volatility gets above the average, I'm always more likely to make this do this type of analysis to try and find out how cheap is this asset? How cheap is this straddle? Is it really cheap or is it just slightly cheap? And in this case, I'm going to go here and look at the September 20th. Then 94, 93 is the 95s. So I would look at the 95. See, I'm getting about $3 discount to the FOV value. But I like to look at that in percentage terms. So if I just off screen do a little calculation here and say 7.10 divided by 10.21, get 69.53. The current price is 69%, so it's about a 31% discount to value. And if I go move this back to current, oops, too far. I go move this back to current and look at that option series that I pulled up earlier. Looking at the 90 here, and I do that same calculation. 0.7 divided by 4.1. It's about a 9% discount to value. So they're cheap. When I'm doing straddle trades, I want to find stuff that's really cheap, like 20 to 30% discount to value. And now I will tell you there are some that are even bigger discounts. You might see something that's like a discount of 90% to value. That's the case. If we go back to that list, so here on CBM, you can tell let's go look at CBM. Is ridiculously cheap, right? We look at that MDM graph, and you can see here the reason why is because there's a fundamental reason. CBM is in a merger takeover situation. Looking at that chart, and I can tell because the options are just way too cheap. So the area of how cheap am I really looking for? 20 to 30% is what I typically look for. That's what I want to find when I'm trying to find a straddle trade. So when volatility gets a little bit higher, even though these are the cheapest in the market right now, might not be that cheap. They might just be a little cheap. They're the cheapest in the market, but I don't know how cheap they are until I go and look at each one of them and find out where they are relative to their history. Specifically, what I'm talking about is not necessarily the stock history as much as I'm talking about the option history, and that's implied volatility. Implied volatility, I look at that, and that will give me my answer whether the options are cheap right now or maybe not so cheap.